Our topic for today is the conduction system of the heart. We have studied quite a bit of the heart so far, and you likely understand its chambers, its valves, its vessels. We learned in those lectures that there were two phases to the contraction of the heart called systole and diastole. We're going to talk about those now and talk about how does the heart actually regulate its rhythmic contractions. The first point to make is that the heart is autorhythmic, that all the cells in the heart are capable of spontaneous contraction. That's cardiac muscle cells can just act totally on their own. And when they do, if you remember cardiac muscle, those signals then spread from cell to cell to cell. And if that was starting up in several different places in the heart all at the same time, the heart could be very chaotic. But the heart is autorhythmic. Its cells can spontaneously contract. The heartbeat does not require a brain. Your brain can influence the heart's contractions, but it cannot cause the contraction or cause any change in the rhythmicity of the heart. Various parts of the heart must contract in a sequence if the heart is going to function properly. The contractions need to be organized. A nice analogy to this would be an orchestra. If you've ever been to a concert and heard an orchestra play, often what you hear before the orchestra is sort of a chaotic sound. When various members of the orchestra are warming up, each playing their own little difficult part perhaps, practicing a little bit, everybody's doing something different, and it's very, very chaotic. But when the conductor steps forward and begins to control the orchestra, when the orchestra all responds to the conductor, then every part is played at the right time, and the whole thing sounds beautiful, and it works the way it's supposed to work. So this is what we want the heart to do. We don't want all of its cells to just chaotically contract whenever they want to. We need an organized kind of contraction to take place in the heart. So we're going to talk about the conduction system. And we want to understand that this is going to create a rhythm within the heart. Now think about what is a rhythm. Probably the best way to describe it is a series of beats and pauses. If you look at music, the notes on a score of music tell you when to play what notes. It gives you the timing of those. A person playing the drums is beating out a rhythm. Rhythm is not speed. You can have a rhythm, and you can have the same recognized rhythm whether it's fast or slow. For example, if you just clap your hands, this is a rhythm. Here's another rhythm. Here's another rhythm. If I do this over and over, you would recognize a rhythm. You can take a rhythm and speed it up or slow it down. If I was doing this, we can speed it up or slow it down. You can recognize that it's the same rhythm, whether it's slow or fast. It's the sequence of the claps that creates the rhythm. And that's what we have when we're dealing with the heart. The heart generates its own rhythm. The nervous system can speed that rhythm up or slow that rhythm down, but the nervous system or the brain cannot influence the rhythm. The rhythm itself comes from the structure of the heart, and this conduction system that we're about to describe is responsible for that. Let's remember when we talked about the valves opening and closing of the heart and some things related to that, we talked about the atria and the ventricles and how they contract. Remember, there is a ventricular phase, resting phase, called diastole, and there's a pumping phase called systole. When the ventricles are contracting, that's systole. When they're relaxing, it's diastole. So ventricles relax here while the atria are contracting. During that ventricular relaxation phase, the atria are contracting to fill the ventricle with blood. During the pumping phase, the ventricles are contracting, but the atria are relaxing and they are filling with blood again, so that during the next diastole, they will have a quantity of blood to inject into the ventricles. So, two phases in the heartbeat. Now, let's look at what we've been talking about in the abstract, the conduction structures of the heart. These coordinate the contractions of the heart. The structures in the atria and the ventricle, or the structures they run between the atria and the ventricle. There are a couple of nodes here. You can notice they're up near the right atrium. And these are stimulating centers for this rhythmic contraction. Then you'll notice toward the ventricular area there are a lot of fibers down throughout the ventricular muscle. And if you saw, we recently did a dissection of the heart, if you saw little white fibers down in the bottom of the ventricles that weren't chordae tendineae, those would have been some of the fibers that we're about to talk about here. So let's go through the parts here one at a time and describe what role they play in regulating the heart's rhythm. The sinoatrial node is what is known as the pacemaker of the heart. And it's right up here in the right atrium. You can't see it in a dissected heart. You pretty much have to cut through the tissue, put it under a microscope to notice that there are a group of cells that are different from cardiac muscle fibers, and that this little group of cells is capable of generating a contraction. This is the heart's pacemaker because it has the fastest rhythm. I said that every part of the heart could contract, but most of those spontaneous contractions occur very slowly. And so they don't really have time to generate a chaotic rhythm before the sinoatrial node has begun a rhythmic pulse for each heartbeat. So it's a little tough to describe how that works, but let's just say that this sinoatrial node is the pacemaker of the heart. Imagine that it begins the contraction, spreads that contraction to the cells nearby, and little by little those contractions then spread from cell to cell throughout the atria. And so in our sequence of rhythmic contraction, we're going to begin with diastole. We're going to begin with the atria contracting and forcing blood down into ventricles that are ready to receive it. Now, that contracting signal passing through the atria stops when it gets to the bottom of the atria. I need you to think back to our lecture where we talked about the heart. Remember, we described the 4 valves and their connective tissues as being the skeleton of the heart, and that skeleton was also an insulator or isolator of the 2 parts of muscle. And so the atria will contract right down to the skeleton, but when the final cells contract near there, they do not stimulate the ventricular muscle to contract. So all this sinoatrial node gives us is an atrial contraction, squeezing the blood down into the ventricles. If we go back to our picture of diastole, ventricles are relaxed, right? Contraction of the atria then pushes the blood down into the ventricle. This is what is happening from the sinoatrial node. Okay? So, now what happens next? We have the atrial contraction. Now notice at the bottom of the atria there is another node, and this is called the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node is going to be able to pick up that atrial contraction because it's on the atrial side of the heart. It's going to send that signal then across the skeleton, across the isolating structures, into the ventricular structures. So we are passing the signal from the atria to the ventricle, but we're doing it by way of this system with the atrioventricular node and its connected fibers. It's not just jumping across that skeleton. The atrioventricular node actually has a rhythm of its own, but that rhythm is slower than the sinoatrial node. So the atrioventricular node is never able to do its own thing because it waits longer to send its beat than the next beat arrives from the sinoatrial node. So the sinoatrial node, in a sense, is always overriding the natural rhythm or the natural signal from the atrioventricular node. If the sinoatrial node were to fail, the atrioventricular node could send a pulsing signal down into the ventricles all on its own, but it would be slower than it would be from the sinoatrial node. So this is the atrioventricular node. Now you see the fibers connected to it. The atrioventricular node then has a bundle called the atrioventricular bundle, used to be called the bundle of His, that crosses the connective tissues and gets the signal down into the ventricular area. But instead of the signal in the ventricles being passed from cell to cell to cell, you can see that this set of fibers here is a distribution channel to get that signal immediately out to all the cells at once. So there is a right bundle branch. That atrioventricular bundle splits, and the right bundle branch then spreads through the right ventricle. The left bundle branch spreads through the left ventricle. The fibers get smaller and smaller until they finally end in little structures, little fibers that are connected into the cardiac muscle cells, into the myocardium, and those are called Purkinje fibers. So rather than a spreading contraction here, we have taken and distributed the contracting signal out to every single cell at once. And this makes for a slightly different sort of contraction. The atrial contraction is more what we would describe as a wave-like contraction. It's from the top down. The atrial muscle is smaller. You remember the dissected heart, those auricles that were sort of constricted there. If you spread those out, if you expanded them again, the walls of the auricles that surround the atria are very thin. So it's a small contraction. The ventricular contraction, though, is instantaneous. It's holistic. All the cells contract at once. There's so much more muscle tissue involved here that we get a different type of contraction. One way to think of this is to think of perhaps a time when you've been to a concert or a sporting event. Something happens often in concerts or sporting events that is wave-like, and maybe you've heard of doing the wave. The cells here, the cardiac muscle cells, do something like the wave. If you think of, if you've ever sat in a stadium and watched the wave go through a crowd, you want to ask yourself, how does each person know when to stand up and do their part? And of course the answer is when the person next to them does it, that in a sense is the stimulus for them to stand up, raise their arms. They sit back down. but their standing up is the stimulus to the person next to them to stand up. And so you can watch this wave of, quote, contraction spreading from person to person to person around a sea of people. And this is very much like what we would describe the atrial contraction as being like. It's right because it contracts from the top down, so the blood is squeezed from the top down toward the ventricles. Now the ventricular contraction is different. The ventricular contraction is instantaneous. This is more like the part in the concert, or more likely in a sporting event, where at the very beginning of the event, someone makes an announcement. Please rise for the national anthem. And when that is stated, everyone in the stadium stands up together. There's no wave-like standing from person to person. Everybody responds to a single instruction, and they all stand in unison. And this is what is happening in the ventricles. The ventricles need one massive contraction. Remember, the ventricles are creating the blood pressure that forces blood through the arteries of the human body. We can actually see the magnitude of these contractions when we look at what is called an EKG. Here's an EKG tracing, and likely you've seen this on hospital shows on TV or in some sort of medical setting. The tracing that you see here represents the electrical activity of the heart. The higher the peaks or valleys are, the more cells are involved, the more electrical stimulation is going on. If we look at the contraction we've just talked about, the atrial contraction comes first, and that is indicated here by the P wave, which is right here. You can see that it's not very tall. There's not a lot of muscle in the atria. It's sustained over a certain period of time, but you can sort of see it's kind of like a wave-like thing where we come into the contraction and we go out of the contraction. Contrast that with its next door neighbor here, what we call the QRS complex. This represents the ventricular contraction. Notice how large it is. That helps to show us how many cells are involved. And notice how sort of instantaneous it is. All of those cells contracting in one big swatch. When you get to your physiology class, you're going to be recording these tracings for each of the people in your lab group. You're going to record your own EKG for your own heart, which is an interesting thing to do. And there's a lot that we can learn about how a heart is beating by looking at this. If there are problems in the heart, especially with its rhythmicity, rhythmic contractions, you can see those. Look at several of the tracings that you see here in this image, and you can see how different they look from the way that they're supposed to look. The EKG tracing can tell us a lot about what's going on in the rhythmic contraction of the heart. And of course, this whole contraction, this rhythmic contraction, is responsible for the heart sounds that we hear. The contraction of the muscle, remember, is what opens and closes the valves. Valves don't work on their own. They're just simply responding to the movement of blood that is created by the contraction of the atria or the ventricles. And of course, diastolic and systolic blood pressure, again, are regulated by the contraction of the heart. There's a picture in your textbook that shows all the different activities that are related to the heart and its beating. You can see the upper part is the EKG tracing, which records electrical activity. Pressure changes are indicated in the second part of this diagram. So you can see where pressure in the atria gets great or pressure in the ventricles gets great as the contraction proceeds. You can compare that then to the valve action. The valve area shows when the valves are opening and when the valves are closing. The amount of blood volume in the chambers is shown, where the volume increases as a chamber fills and where it decreases as a chamber empties. And then you see at the bottom of this image the heart sounds and the different sounds that are created as the valves open and close. So this is a nice summary diagram. You don't need to know all these details, but you will need to know these when you get to your physiology class. So we're just getting started here and helping you. You can see this is going to be a huge foundation for all that you do, especially when you get to that EKG lab. The more you know about this conduction system, the better. And so just summarizing, the conduction system is a series of structures. You need to know the two nodes, the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node. Make sure you know the fiber structure here with the atrioventricular bundle, the right bundle branch, the left bundle branch, and the Purkinje fibers. And understand that they are spreading the contracting signal and creating a rhythm so that both atria and ventricles don't contract at the same time. We want atria contracting and then ventricles contracting. And this system of structures in the heart is what is responsible for that. Okay, study this, make sure you understand it, make sure that you can identify those structures within the heart and that you know what they do. You're building a foundation for this class and any testing that will go on, as well as your physiology class.